The hotel was just another 4-star carbon copy of all the others. The room had a large double bed with white sheets, its all too familiar light strip placed just above the pillows, and a long full-length mirror up on a singular wall with a forlorn-looking hairdryer just dangling from an elastic black cord, moving into the hole left by the applicator itself. The floor was made of the kind of faux wood which hotel proprietors all over the world like to install in their ultra-modern buildings, just to give them a feeling of supposed classiness, but which in reality merely made them look as if the builders had forgotten to finish the building itself. The white walls lining the room were adorned with equally modern, half-enclosed, dull lights, operated by a dimmer switch next to the door. On the right, just before the bed itself, was the door into the bathroom, which looked as if it could equally be at home in a particularly self-conscious brothel, complete with purple low lighting as an extra setting. Equally sleazy. The white fluffy towels hung off the bare metal of the heater, and the shower gently cascaded water down into the plug hole, followed by the inevitable sound of the sewer system swallowing it whole in an almost pleasurable spasm of gurgling. The extractor fan buzzed and whirred outside, only to be drowned out by the waterfall which it was competing with, a competition which it was always doomed to lose. The shower, after all, only had one customer to please. The extractor fan had to share its resources with the entirety of the hotel, from the sweaty, overweight and panting tourist with bleeding feet from a day's sore steps through the city, right over to the beautiful, athletic and silent escort looking forward to collecting her day's pay. Instead of all that, the shower could take all the time in the world going over its only client, sending jets of steamy hot water all over skin and hair alike in an almost sensual display of the laws of nature. The mirror opposite the shower door had, by now, fogged up all the way to the top, much like the glass of the shower itself. In the next room, under those standard cotton sheets contending with the low noise of the television happily perched on top of the cupboard, was the almost childlike sound of a sleeping form. A form whose back was exposed to the cold air of the December Geneva night. The covers had rather reluctantly come unstuck from her upper body, a smooth lump of skin-like flesh which they had been protecting for hours previous. Her white alabaster skin was only interrupted by the defined outline of a great tattoo across her back, which seemed to rise from somewhere down below the sheets that covered her. The exposed flesh of her back only showing the creature from torso up, a torso that had been inked to perfection, giving off the impression that the clothes were real. They seemed to crinkle and crease like the real thing, and the art was superb indeed, and even looked to be moving in certain areas. The figure on her back then opened up from its petite torso and spread out across her shoulder blades with powerfully drawn wings, which seemed to move from side to side every time she let out a gentle breath. These tattooed wings came up from there into the neck of the figure, before its painted face then became hidden by the long blonde hair of the sleeping form. Hair which seemed to be so fine that it could only come from some sort of divine angel-like spirit. The form lay dormant, face plunged into the pillow, so peacefully that the scene could have almost been something which would have been happier in an art gallery than on this mortal plane of reality. The peace of the scene and the almost meditatively relaxing sounds of dripping water played over the sound of a gentle fan was suddenly interrupted by the sound of the water shutting off. Out of the shower came 2 feet with a small covering of hair over the top, which then led down into 5 well-kept toes. Long legs then followed, covered in small lesions hard to see with the naked eye unless particularly well acquainted with the form itself. These legs then led gently past the bruised and slightly battered knees up into the male form's hips which came tight into his body itself and led into the groin and then up to the lower torso. Muscular form then took over, and the outwards bump formed by the powerful abdominal muscles became the norm, travelling upwards and spreading out into firm oblique muscles, which were then crisscrossed with the pale flesh of scar tissue recently formed. The water dripped across the male form's skin, gently rolling off his strong pectoral muscles, which seemed to hold the whole thing together, muscles which then soon gave way onto his neck, and from there up to his face. He stood in front of the mirror, and used the towel to wipe away the condensation caused by the heat, rubbing his neck with the towel, squeezing his biceps into an all-too-familiar shape as he reached down his back to get to those infamously hard-to-reach places around everyone's lower back. His back, unlike the front, had clearly led a life of danger and risk. It was defined by a series of great scars lining his back down on either side of his spine, cuts which had once clearly hurt greatly and might even hurt still. To the bottom, just above the belt line, lay a small tattoo in black ink, a tattoo which looked as if it had always been there, and had now become so well entrenched within his body that it, in its own way, had become a scar too, a similar reflection of his life. When he looked back up, he could see now that his face in the mirror was staring back at him, perfectly clearly. The fogged-up glass had now returned back to its default setting, and he looked into the room. The sleeping female form had begun to wake. She found her eyes opening slowly. She turned her head to the side and saw the shut blinds of the large arched window. She let out a sigh and moved her body to the side, heaving it up. As she moved her hair forward and sat up in bed, the final part of her tattoo became visible. It was the smiling face of a masked, jester-like figure, an angular face whose tip came down into the body of an angel. Monstrous black eyes poked from its face, and a brightly coloured hat fanned out into arms with hanging baubles dropping from them. The whole horrific visage tattooed upon her was coloured in a dark, black, sickly colour of clotted blood, blood which had only recently been extracted. It was more than a tattoo. It was a mark, a brand, a display of ownership and power. She looked down at the sheets as her hair fell gently down her chest, covering it up, and her whole body was covered in skin that looked so utterly smooth that it might well be made of the very cloth in which she lay. She sat on her lap, her lower half still protected by the warmth of the sheets, but her torso was now plainly visible. She was demonstrably thin, with a once muscular but now clearly atrophied form plain to see. Her mind now recovered from the events of the afternoon, and was filled with melancholia and despair. There was no way out for her. Her once beautiful and vibrant expression, an expression which he had once seen in videos and photos from thousands of miles away, was gone. Her brown freckles, which had once spread themselves from one cheek to the other via her long thin nose, had been taken over instead by the sallow cheeks of a woman desperately in need of something to sustain herself. Her arms were pock-marked by the stinging, scarring, numbing touch of the needle, and her body, which had, days prior, begun to scream for the blessed nectar of the poppy plant, had now clearly given up and lay in surrender to the new order. The male form came out of the shower, and she watched him motionless and emotionless, as the doorknob turned open and his form came forward with a cloud of steam. His bright eyes, the colour of ice water, looked towards her in a look of pity and disgust. She in turn saw in him the unending darkness which his beauty had masked for so many of those in which he had encountered. But her family had a long gift for witnessing the depravity in others. It was a skill she dearly wished she did not possess in his company. So much easier it would have been to forget the hate, the violence, and the sadism which she knew was inside his soul, and instead merely embrace him as if his physical form was all that could matter. But her knowledge of his soul was overpowering, and it fueled a deep hate inside her, a hate with which she knew not what to do. and which made every moment with him unbearable. It was painful to feel his touch on her skin, painful to hear his voice close up in her ears, and painful to feel within him his soul. To her, his face, which could have been sculpted by a master of stone, with its angular jawline, well-defined cheekbones, symmetrical eyes, and perfect aquiline nose, was instead a terrifying visage of sheer spirit-sucking loathing. The visage of a predator, not a man, a demon, not an angel. He was a being more toxic to her than the heroin on which her body now depended, and she was determined not to fall into his addicting gaze, which she could feel, and had clearly been the doom of so many souls before her. They sat there in silence. She stared dead at the television as he put on his clothes. She wished that she could escape this place and jump into the television program. The camera swung around from the weatherman, whose smile was spread across his lips as he joked and mucked around with the two presenters. They seemed to love each other's company, and she felt as if the TV screen was the only light in the room, the only form of escape, albeit escape on a mental level. All the colour seemed to fade from her situation as she fixated on the shining teeth of the presenters, the serious faces relaying serious news, and the flashy advertisements projecting a life which she now could never have. Time froze as her mind displaced itself within the situation. She closed her eyes, and her imagination flooded her with the world that she wished she could have. Her environment had been transformed, and in an eye blink the room was filled with the rushing of runners, the loud chat of directors and producers, and the bright lights of the stage. She felt constrained and hot, and looking around she realized she was no longer sat on the end of a bed, but she was in fact in a dark blue seat. The fabric felt itchy against her exposed arms, and in front of her was not the bleakness of her new reality creeping upon her very soul, but instead an adoring legion of audience members. Fat ones, thin ones, pretty ones, ugly ones. Over 100 eyes staring at her. Smiles on their faces, applause upon their hands, adoration radiating from their very beings. The host looked at her, his face blurred, semi-constructed, not fully formed, but there. Its features hidden from her perception, but his voice so clear. It was filtering through her unconscious mind, through the television, flickering away in her real reality. The questions came at her, and in her mind she was answering them every bit as perfectly as the soft-minded soap star that was currently under the harmless interrogation techniques of this most genial presenter. But suddenly, her daydream was broken. She was once more in her reality. She heard her captor get up from the bed, the springs disrupting her dream world. She looked over to him, the orange light of the hotel room gently caressing her eyes, as if they were slowly warming her once more into the real world. She looked at his face, a face which was perpetually locked in the semi-furious, semi-not-quite-there nature of the man. But she could sense a feeling in the room. A new, very dangerous, very powerful sense of dread and violence. She became aware of how quiet the hotel now was, and just how cold it was here, high up in Geneva. Her body began to tingle with some kind of terrifying anticipation. She looked at her arms, and to her shock, she realized that the tiny hairs on her milk-white skin had begun to stand to attention. He was by the door, ear firmly close to the wood. The cold wind penetrated her bones. The fear her heart, and the potential danger her mind. She stood up from the bed, but as she did so, the new scarring on her back ripped through the skin ever so slightly, and she screamed out in pain. Her captor turned around quickly, gun in hand, pointed firmly at her. Just as she was about to put her hands up, a deafening sound erupted through the winter air. In her mind, it had sounded with decibels only equal to a nuclear explosion. Splintering wood went flying. The brass doorknob flew fast, just missing her head, penetrating the window, forming cracks in the glass. She was knocked back by her body's quick reactions and smashed the now bleeding back, dripping with ink and blood, against the hard surface of the wall. She screamed again as the vibrations coursed through her body, energy rippling through her from the hard, cold wall. The vibrations tore through skin, so recently cut as to send another shock wave up her spinal column, causing an insatiable, stinging sensation. She winced and closed her eyes in an attempt to shut out the pain, her ears overwhelmed by the kinetic shock of the moment itself. Her captor, however, quickly regained his composure. The shotgun blast tore through the door, and he reacted with surprisingly well-thought-out speed. Reactions which had once, long ago, got him noticed in a far-forgotten corner of Sicily. An event which had changed his life, and which now looked like it might lead him to his death. Out of the blast came a boot, which smashed through the lower door panel. Thinking quickly, he stamped hard down upon the ankle of the man whom had penetrated the door, and had provoked the forward momentum of his would-be murderer, who was now falling through the door frame itself. The captor jumped back as the murderer fell onto his face. He dived across the room, landing on the far side of the bed. The attacker was incapacitated, but before he could get his personal weapon from the cupboard, he was all too quickly set upon from something powerful which had jumped onto his body from behind. Following his move almost to the letter, a leap, something powerful and acrobatic about it. And now he could feel two powerful thighs gripping him from the ribs, holding him in a position from which there was no escape, and there was no way out. And he was realizing all too late what was going on here. He suddenly faced the brutal reality that his death might be creeping close at last. But then there was a silence. Nothing. Not a bird. Not a tear. Not a single solitary footstep. Only the sound of the television remained uninterrupted. He closed his eyes. He didn't know who they were or what they were, but he knew that his time was up. It was that small niggle that you have deep within you that you can't explain, the feeling that you've done everything that you could do or would ever do. The feeling that you're at the end of your timeline, and for others to move, your journey must come to an all too painful end. But before he went to meet judgment for all the crimes which he had committed in the name of profit and honour, he would first demand to see the faces of those whom had come to remove him from this plane of reality. His assailants quickly robbed that opportunity from him, as they began their own sordid dialogue. "Andre, you are out of breath. I think you might need a little more training." "Shut up. If that filthy girl weeping in the corner hadn't screamed, I would be the one holding his head, and you would be the one standing at the door like an idiot." "It's funny, I always thought that Dante's protege might be a bit more of a challenge. It turns out that he is as weak as all these young puppies nowadays. We should take our time, Andre. Send Dante a message in blood." "Lucrezia, we don't have time. Let him look us in the eyes when he dies. After all, that is the pleasure which we have time for. The blood code that we want to send to that fool Dante would take too long. Well, too long for a twisted girl like you anyway." "Careful, Andre. You're beginning to sound like you actually care about the rules. The language of blood is the only thing he understands, otherwise he'll..." "Yes, well, we'll deal with that later.
And anyway, I think we reached the point of no return on the rules a long time ago. Now hurry up, we have to get the girl out of here. And by the looks of it, she won't come quietly. Let's get this done and go before certain people in the Geneva police get word of the situation here.
He recognized their voices. In fact, he recognized their mutual sniping all too well. And Dante, well, he definitely knew that name. But how could they know that unless... And then it occurred to him. He did know them. They were legends. Their exploits filled volumes upon volumes at the training centre. And when Dante had first taken him on, it was them who he demonstrated as shining examples of the craft. And now they were here to administer the final death blow. The final death blow to him? He was confused and prayed in silence that they would spare him the indignities of the blood code. He could hear the woman whom he had been charged to protect sobbing quietly in the corner, and he felt like sobbing with her. For he knew that only the great darkness of the underworld awaited him now, an eternity in sulphite fire, of brimstone and lakes of lava and judgment for eternity and infinity were all that was waiting for him, waiting to avenge those whom he had harmed in this life. The woman in the corner had finally opened her eyes, her body allowing her to at last perceive her situation. Her knees were drawn up close to her naked form. A prehistoric urge to protect oneself had taken over, like some kind of machine protocol. She brushed her hair over her face and only dared to look up for a moment. There she could see two figures, one standing at the door, dressed in a grey suit, grey trousers and a blue tie, a tie which dangled down across the upper part of his shirt, and the other figure, who was now stood up, and her former captor, the man whom she so feared earlier in the day, was sat on the bed, as naked and vulnerable as she felt. His head was bowed, and the other individual, who appeared to be a woman, stood over him. She had pitch-black hair, which dangled in a tight ponytail down her back, reaching her mid-back. She wore thick, large black boots, which led up to uncomfortable-looking tight leather trousers covered with zips and hoops. Her upper body was encased in a very similar kind of item, pocket-laden and leather hugging her impossibly athletic figure, which covered up almost the entirety of her skin, and her hands were masked by the same leather material as that of her co-attacker's gloves. But then the woman knelt down, and for a slight moment she caught a glimpse of this attacker's face. The female attacker placed a complicated-looking helmet down on the floor. A helmet which looked as if it would be an all-encompassing, save only from two eye sockets. It seemed like it had a zip line over the top and sides of the helmet, but she couldn't be sure from her position in the corner. It all looked rather bizarre, and she felt more curious than scared. It reminded her more of her evenings as a student in Leipzig, rather than a petrifying murderous visage as it might have appeared to others, less experienced in the rather murky world of sensations which she herself occasionally indulged in. But then, just as her heart had begun to rest itself, she caught the face of the female attacker. A face which made her recoil in horror. It was not ugly. In fact, it was a face of astonishing beauty. Beauty which was unworldly in its nature. Her face was the palest pale which she had ever seen, so white as to look more like snow than any skin tone she had seen on this world. In fact, she herself was dark in comparison to this woman. The face was deeply angular, with jawlines cut deep into her cheeks, which had forced her cheekbones high up into her face. Her forehead sloped backward, partially pulled by her tight ponytail, and partially formed by the sheer tight-skinned nature of her face, almost as if the skin itself had been pulled upon her skull, rather than tailor-made for the occasion at birth. Her lips were dark red, more scarlet in colour than the usual pink, lips which now spread across her face like a hungry, insatiable smile. She was looking straight at her, and she felt the woman's eyes boring into her, looking at her as if she was some kind of meal item on a grisly menu of the senses. They locked eyes with each other, and she felt fear and excitement on the same level, and the leather-clad creature winked ever so slightly at her, licking her lips in a serpentine motion. The gaze felt like it lasted a lifetime, and it made her blood run hot and cold at the same time. These strange feelings were cut short, however, by the clear-cut voice of the female attacker's colleague. She tried to work out his accent, but she couldn't quite be sure of where he was from. It was too generic, too normal, to allow her any insight as to the origin of her new captors.
Lucrezia, stop it. If you want to do something useful instead of unnerving a new client, then go over to her and introduce yourself.
Fine. You know, Andre, this job used to be more interesting. What happened to you?
Andre let out a bored sigh, and then turned to the man whom he had come to hunt, sitting there on the bed. He had never been too sure about this man. To him he had seemed like a mere child, when he had been introduced to him all but 3 years prior. He could never quite work out what Dante's intentions had been with this boy. He barely had a year on his criminal record and only 2 murders which appeared to be unintentional at best. It was all rather disgusting, and the light began to flicker slightly. Andre looked up to examine it. His face was tired and worn out. This boy on the end of the bed, who had said little since the moment when Lucretia had pounced upon him, at last piped up, sensing a moment of reduced tension in the air. To be honest, I think a splitter must have, disrupted the mechanism. Andre looked at him quizzically. He was wondering whether he should bother to engage in this conversation. He was going to kill him, after all. Did he really think that communicating with a dead man was worth it? He looked utterly pathetic. His scars, which had obviously had their effect on the quivering captive in the corner, were nothing that Andre hadn't seen 1,000,000 times before. His shaven head, supposed to add to the dangerous feel of the man, just made him look like a low-rent Jason Statham, and his tattoos had not been done with blood, but with ink. A weak substitute, in Andre's opinion. But yet spending the last month with Lucretia had taken its toll on Andre, and if he was honest, he'd be quite glad to talk to a normal man for once. Travelling undercover with a wandering circus had its benefits, but finding normal people with whom to converse was not one of them. He looked across the wooden floor with a dismissive look, one cheek raised by a muscular manoeuvre which could have originally destined to become a smile, but which had come out to be born as a look of disdain, with the other half of his mouth remaining in the same position. He looked at Lucretia, who was now kneeling next to their new client, gently stroking her blonde hair and calming her down. He chuckled silently at the thought of Lucretia, the counsellor. She was a cast-iron maniac, but yet there she was, playing the part of a therapist. The irony bit him hard, and he determined that it wouldn't be too bad to give the young boy a final conversation. He walked over to the desk and pulled out the chair from underneath, catching a glimpse of himself in the mirror briefly. He felt slightly unconscious and tried to tuck in his belly, which in reality didn't exist, but the man was vanity impersonated. Eventually he moved past the mirror and planted the chair firmly in front of the soon-to-be dead man.
So, do you know a lot about electronics then?
Well, I think it's pronounced electronics.
To be honest, I don't really think that you are in a position to be correcting pronunciation and the finer points of English linguistics with me.
Well, you might have a point there, Andrew. You know, I don't understand this, though. I mean, the situation. I mean, what are you doing here? Andre looked at him, somewhat sympathetically, smiling slightly, and then, looking down at his expensive-looking watch, which glimmered gently in the low light, he realized that time was not on his side. He looked back up and continued in his accent. Strange, bizarre, but strangely placeable. And he returned to speaking in perfect English.
Well, let's say we have 5 minutes until the hotel manager calls the police. 5 minutes after that, the number 8 in Geneva will get a phone call from the chief of police here. 5 minutes after that, the number 8 will authorize the police to come to this situation. 2 minutes later, the police will arrive, and we will all be gone. Although, of course, physically you will still be here. Metaphorically, though, you will be included in the list of the... For your soul will pass from this world to the next, never to return. So in the last moments of your life, let's talk. Talk about something other than this grubby world which we inhabit.
Do you like history? His soon-to-be victim looked at the floor. He was thinking about all the things that he should have done while he was still alive and within the legal framework of society. He thought about his sister and his mother, and how he should have done more to keep them safe and secure. He thought about his child in Genoa, who hardly knew him, the boy who he'd sworn to look after upon joining his old family, and whom was now the plaything of cruel rich kid bullies. He thought about his own addiction to gambling, and his failure at everything he had ever tried, except murder. And really he didn't feel much like talking, but could see that it was this or go now. Right now.
Well, I like art. Oh, do you have a particular favourite?
Hieronymus Bosch. The two men locked eyes with each other, and Andre started to think that maybe this child wasn't as naive as he had first believed him to be. Just as they began to lock horns on the finer point of artistic talent, Lucretia's smooth voice reached his ears, the sound waves floating just below the great dips common in human speech, remaining constant in an almost hungry tone. Andre, we are leaving now. Meet me outside when you are finished with this boy. Without turning around, Andre nodded, hardly acknowledging her presence. The two women, so mismatched but now utterly interlinked with each other, gently shut what remained of the door behind them and began to walk down the corridor. Lucretia had dressed the girl up in clothes from a small holdall that Andre had brought up with them, but which had almost inevitably got lost in the dazzle and blaze of the previous few minutes. The girl was dressed in a simple grey tracksuit and matching hooded top. A pair of brand new white trainers were on her feet, and it was obvious that she was having difficulty adjusting to the new footwear. She walked slowly, limping slightly, which seemed to irritate her new guardian somewhat. Lucretia moved on ahead briskly, scornfully mocking the state with which her new client was now in.
Look at you. You look like a street girl. Some dirty creature that nobody would want. Have some pride in yourself. Stand up, for God's sake. We're saving you.
The girl said nothing, and dragged herself still slower behind. Looking down at her feet, now surrounded by purple, slightly fading carpet, the wall which surrounded them were a dull pale colour so common in hotels, and which seemed to add to the feeling of hopelessness which the girl now felt that she had become encased in. Then, as if nothing had ever taken place, Lucretia calmly opened the faux wooden door to the staircase, walked down the dusty, neglected, picture-laden corridor, and vanished, leaving only the swinging momentum of the fire door behind. End of chapter 1.